Everyone thinks Goodfellas is one of the greatest mob movies ever made, and they're right. But here's what nobody tells you. The real story was so violent, so disturbing, and so psychologically twisted that even Martin Scorsese, a director who's never shied away from brutal violence, had to tone it down for the movie. The man who inspired Joe Pesci's Oscar-winning character, Tommy DeVito, his real name was Tommy DeSimone, and he didn't just kill people in fits of rage. His actual body count and the methods he used were so brutal that portions of his FBI file remain sealed to this day. We're talking about a man who murdered with such frequency and such casual brutality that even hardened mafia bosses were disturbed by him. And Henry Hill, the supposedly charming hustler played by Ray Liotta, the guy wasn't some lovable rogue who got caught up in circumstances beyond his control. He was a lifelong criminal, an addict who destroyed every single person who ever trusted him, and a man who continued committing crimes even after the federal government gave him a new identity and a fresh start. Before we dive into this rabbit hole, do me a favor, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I'm curious how many of you are watching this. And hit that subscribe button, because this story has layers most people never discover. Let's get into it. What I'm about to show you over the next few hours will fundamentally change how you see that movie. Because the truth is darker, stranger, and more disturbing than anything Hollywood could show you. Let me start with something most people don't know. Martin Scorsese and screenwriter Nicholas Pileggi actually removed murders from the movie. Not because they didn't have the budget or the time, but because they thought audiences wouldn't believe how many people these men actually killed. They thought it would strain credulity. Think about that for a second. The movie that shocked audiences with its violence? That was the toned-down version. So forget everything you think you know about Goodfellas. Forget the charm, forget the humor, forget the Rolling Stones soundtrack that made it all seem cool. What you're about to hear is the real story, drawn from FBI files, court documents, police reports, interviews with the actual criminals, and testimony from the people whose lives they destroyed. This is going to take a while, so get comfortable. We're going down the rabbit hole, and I promise you, it's deeper and darker than you ever imagined. Let's start with Henry Hill, because he's the one who told the story. He's the narrator, the protagonist, the guy we're supposed to root for. But here's the first hard truth you need to understand. Henry Hill was a compulsive liar, a career criminal, and one of the most unreliable narrators in true crime history. The movie opens with that famous line, "As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster." It's a great line. It sets up the whole movie. But what the movie doesn't tell you is that Henry Hill wasn't some working-class kid who got seduced by the glamour of mob life. He was a sociopath who found his people. Henry Hill was born on June 11th, 1943, in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn, New York. His father, Henry Hill Sr., was an Irish-American electrician. His mother, Carmela Costa, was Sicilian. This is important because in the traditional mafia structure, you had to be full Italian to be a made man, to be formally inducted into the mafia family. Henry's Irish heritage meant he could never be made. No matter how many crimes he committed or how much money he earned, he would always be an associate, never a full member. The movie shows young Henry looking out his window at the cab stand across the street, watching the wise guys come and go, mesmerized by their style and power. That part is true. There really was a cab stand, the Euclid Avenue taxicab and limousine service, operated by Paul Vario, a capo in the Lucchese crime family. But the movie makes it seem romantic, like a kid dreaming of becoming an astronaut. The reality was darker. Henry started working at that cab stand when he was 11 years old. 11? Think about that. This wasn't a paper route. Paul Vario and his crew were using this kid to run errands, deliver messages, and do jobs that would seem innocent if a cop stopped him. By the time Henry was 13, he was booking numbers, illegal gambling, and running stolen goods. By 14, he dropped out of school completely. The movie shows Henry's father finding out he'd been skipping school and beating him with a belt. That happened, but what the movie doesn't show you is that Henry didn't care. He took the beating and went right back to the cab stand. Because he'd already made more money in a month, running numbers than his father made in 6 months as an electrician. He'd already tasted the life, and there was no going back. Here's something the movie completely glosses over. Henry Hill's first arrest came in 1960. When he was just 17 years old, he and some other kids were caught using a stolen credit card. He got probation. A year later, he was arrested again for disorderly conduct. Then in 1963, at age 20, he was arrested for assault and battery. The pattern was set. He wasn't some basically good kid who fell in with a bad crowd. He was a bad kid who found exactly where he belonged. In 1965, Henry was drafted into the Army. This is barely mentioned in the movie, but it's crucial to understanding who he really was. The U.S. was escalating the Vietnam War, and Henry Hill was sent to Fort Bragg in North Carolina for basic training. Did he serve his country with honor? Did the discipline of military life straighten him out? No. Henry Hill used his time in the Army to expand his criminal network. He was stationed at Fort Bragg for 2 years, from 1963 to 1965, and he spent that entire time running scams. He was booking bets for other soldiers. He was selling stolen goods. He was operating a loan sharking operation, lending money to desperate soldiers at predatory interest rates. When he got out in 1965, he had more criminal connections than when he went in. By the mid-1960s, Henry was fully embedded in Paul Vario's crew. Vario, called Paulie in the movie, was a capo in the Lucchese family, one of New York's 5 mafia families. Vario's crew operated out of several locations, but their main base was the Euclid Avenue cab stand and a pizzeria called Robert's Lounge. These weren't normal businesses. They were fronts for every kind of crime you could imagine. Loan sharking, bookmaking, hijacking, robbery, extortion, and murder. The movie makes the Vario crew look like a fun gang of colorful characters. In reality, these were violent criminals who hurt people for a living. Paul Vario himself was serving time for contempt of court when Goodfellas was released. He died in prison in 1988, 3 years before the movie came out. The movie couldn't use his real name because of legal concerns, so they called him Paulie Cicero and had Paul Sorvino play him as this stern but fair mob boss. The real Paul Vario was a brutal enforcer who'd risen through the ranks by being willing to do violence that others wouldn't. Now let's talk about how Henry actually made his money. Because the movie only shows you the glamorous parts. Yes, there were hijackings. The movie shows Henry and Tommy hijacking trucks, stealing cigarettes and electronics and booze. That happened, but the movie makes it look easy and fun. Like a game, the reality was more violent. When Henry and his crew hijacked trucks, they didn't just politely ask the driver to hand over the keys. They beat drivers, they threatened their families. If a driver fought back or tried to be a hero, they hurt him badly enough that he'd never try it again. There are documented cases of drivers being hospitalized with broken bones, concussions, and permanent injuries. The movie shows you the theft. It doesn't show you the trauma left behind. And then there was the loan sharking. This is barely touched on in the movie, but it was a huge part of how the crew made money. Here's how it worked. Say you're a small business owner and you need $10,000 to keep your restaurant open. You can't get a bank loan because your credit is bad or because you need the money too fast. So you go to the Vario crew. They'll give you the $10,000, but you're paying them back $12,000. And if you miss a payment, that's when the real price becomes clear. They'd start with threats, then they'd vandalize your business, then they'd hurt you physically. And if you still couldn't pay, they'd take your business, they'd force you to sign it over to them, and then they'd run it as a front for money laundering or burn it down for the insurance money. The movie shows Henry and the crew eating expensive meals and throwing money around. But where did that money come from? It came from destroying the lives of regular people who were just trying to survive. Here's a specific example that's never mentioned in the movie. In 1968, Henry Hill and several associates were arrested for beating a Tampa, Florida gas station attendant and stealing $420 from the station. $420. They beat a man senseless for $420. Henry pleaded guilty to assault and attempted grand larceny and got 4 years in prison. He served less than 2 years before being released in 1970. Think about what that tells you. This wasn't a man who only committed violence when absolutely necessary. This was a man who beat someone nearly to death for pocket change. And the movie doesn't mention this at all, because it would make Henry Hill too unsympathetic. It would make it impossible for you to root for him. When Henry got out of prison in 1970, he went right back to the Vario crew. This is where the movie picks up its main storyline, though it compresses the timeline significantly. By the early 1970s, Henry was working with two men who would define his criminal career and ultimately his downfall, James Burke and Tommy DeSimone. The movie introduces them as Jimmy Conway and Tommy DeVito, played by Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci. But those Hollywood names hide the reality of who these men actually were. We'll get to them in detail later, but understand this. Jimmy Burke was suspected in over 50 murders. Tommy DeSimone was a psychopath who killed for fun and Henry Hill. He worked alongside them for years and never once thought about going to the police. Not because he was loyal, but because he was making money. Let's talk about Henry's personal life, because this is another area where the movie sanitizes reality. The film shows Henry meeting Karen Friedman, played by Lorraine Bracco, and it's this classic tough guy romance. He takes her out, he shows her his world. She falls for the excitement of it all. It's almost charming. The reality was more complicated and more disturbing. Henry Hill met Karen Friedman in 1965. She was a Jewish woman from a middle-class family. She was not from the mob world. And according to Karen herself in later interviews, Henry didn't tell her the full truth about what he did for a living until after they were married. He told her he worked in construction. He told her he had a small business. He lied to her face for months. They got married in 1965. Karen was barely into her 20s. And almost immediately, the marriage was troubled. Henry was cheating on her constantly. The movie shows one mistress, Janice Rossi, the blonde who lived in an apartment Henry kept. But there were others, many others. Henry Hill had multiple affairs throughout his marriage, and he didn't even try to hide them well. Karen knew. She tolerated it because by then she was trapped. She had 2 kids, Greg and Gina, and she was living a lifestyle that her family could never have afforded legitimately. Here's something really dark that the movie completely leaves out. Karen Hill became complicit in Henry's crimes. She wasn't just the mobster's wife who looked the other way. She actively participated when Henry was arrested and facing charges. Karen would help him hide assets. She would deliver messages to other criminals. She would lie to investigators. The movie portrays her as a victim of circumstance. But the truth is more complicated. She made choices, bad choices, and she profited from those choices until it all fell apart. By the mid-1970s, Henry Hill was deep into cocaine. Not just using it, but selling it. This was a massive violation of Mafia protocol. The bosses of the 5 families had agreed that drugs were too risky, too much law enforcement attention, too many informants, too many prison sentences. If you got caught dealing drugs, you were on your own. The family wouldn't protect you. In fact, they might kill you just to eliminate the risk. But Henry didn't care. The money was too good. Cocaine in the 1970s was incredibly profitable. You could buy a kilo for a few $1,000s and sell it for 10 times that. Henry was dealing in serious weight, multiple kilos at a time. And he was using his Mafia connections to move the product and collect debts. He was basically using the Lucchese family's reputation while violating their rules. It was only a matter of time before it caught up with him. The movie shows Henry's descent into cocaine addiction during the famous May 11th, 1980 sequence, where he's paranoid about helicopters following him while he's trying to run multiple drug deals. That day was real. That paranoia was real. But the movie doesn't fully convey just how deep into addiction Henry was. By 1980, he was using cocaine multiple times a day. His nose was destroyed. His judgment was impaired. He was making irrational decisions. He was bringing heat down on himself and everyone around him. On May 27, 1980, Henry Hill was arrested by the Drug Enforcement Administration, along with his wife Karen and several associates. They were charged with conspiracy to distribute narcotics. The evidence was overwhelming. The D had him on wiretaps discussing drug deals. They had surveillance footage. They had cooperating witnesses. Henry Hill was facing 25 years to life in federal prison. And in New York, that meant real time, not the slap-on-the-wrist sentences he'd gotten before. Decades behind bars, he'd die in prison. Here's where the movie compresses things significantly. In the film, Henry gets arrested, immediately realizes he's facing serious time, and decides to cooperate with the FBI. It all happens in what feels like a few days. The reality was more drawn out and more calculated. Henry Hill didn't immediately decide to become a rat. First, he tried to beat the case. He hired lawyers. He tried to get witnesses to change their stories. He thought maybe he could get the charges reduced or thrown out on a technicality. But the case was too strong. The D had done their homework. Henry was going down, and he knew it. Then he tried to get help from the Vario crew. He thought maybe Paul Vario would pull strings, get him a better lawyer, help with bail money. But Vario was keeping his distance. Why? Because Henry had violated the no-drugs rule. Because Henry had brought federal heat. Because Henry was now a liability. In the Mafia, when you become a liability, you become expendable. And that's when Henry Hill realized something that would change his life. Nobody was coming to save him. The crew he dedicated 25 years of his life to? They'd cut him loose. The men he'd committed crimes with, the men he'd protected, the men he'd made money for. They didn't care if he went to prison for the rest of his life. In fact, some of them, especially Jimmy Burke, were probably hoping he'd die there. So Henry Hill made the biggest decision of his life. He contacted the FBI and offered to cooperate. The date was May 16, 1980. Just 11 days after his arrest. And once he started talking, he didn't stop now. Here's what the movie glosses over. Henry Hill didn't just tell the FBI about a few crimes to get his sentence reduced. He gave them everything. He told them about murders. He told them about hijackings, robberies, extortion, loan sharking, bookmaking, and drug dealing. He named names, dozens of names. He described crimes going back over 15 years. He drew diagrams of crime scenes. He identified bodies. He led them to evidence they'd never have found otherwise. The FBI agents who debriefed Henry couldn't believe what they were hearing. This was one of the most comprehensive debriefings in Bureau history. Henry Hill was giving them information that would lead to dozens of arrests and convictions. He was systematically destroying the Vario crew and damaging the entire Lucchese family. And he was doing it all to save himself. But here's the thing. Henry Hill was also lying. Constantly, he'd tell the truth about one crime, then exaggerate details about another to make himself seem more important. He'd confess to being present at murders, then later claim he was just told about them. FBI agents had to cross-check every single thing he said because they knew he was an unreliable narrator. Even while cooperating, Henry Hill couldn't stop being a con man. The information Henry provided led to multiple major prosecutions. Paul Vario was eventually convicted of multiple charges and sent back to prison, where he died in 1988. Dozens of other mobsters and associates went to prison based on Henry's testimony. And most famously, Henry's cooperation led to the investigation of the Lufthansa heist, which we'll get to in detail shortly, and the subsequent murder spree carried out by Jimmy Burke. In exchange for his cooperation, Henry Hill and his family were entered into the Witness Protection Program, officially called the United States Marshal Service Witness Security Program, or WITSEC. This is where the movie ends, with Henry and Karen and their kids being given new identities and relocated to somewhere in America to live as average nobodies. The movie makes it seem like a sad but necessary ending. Henry's in the voiceover lamenting that he has to live the rest of his life as a schnook. But at least he's alive. The end. Credits roll. You leave the theater thinking Henry Hill learned his lesson and lived quietly ever after. That is complete fiction. Here's what actually happened after Henry Hill entered witness protection. he immediately started breaking the rules. WITSEC has strict protocols. You don't contact anyone from your old life. You don't commit crimes in your new identity. You don't draw attention to yourself. You live quietly and legally, or you're out of the program. Henry Hill broke every single one of those rules. First, he couldn't stop drinking and using drugs. Within months of being relocated, he was arrested for public intoxication. The U.S. Marshal Service had to step in and handle it quietly. Then he was arrested for drunk driving. Then for fighting in a bar. Then for drug possession. Each time, the Marshal Service would have to intervene, move him to a new location, give him yet another new identity. This happened multiple times. Second, he couldn't stop committing crimes. Even with a new identity and a fresh start, Henry Hill was still running scams. He'd get a job working in construction, then steal tools and materials from the job site. He'd take out loans using his new identity and never pay them back. He'd write bad checks. He was a criminal his entire life. And witness protection didn't change that. Third, he couldn't keep his mouth shut. This is the most unbelievable part. Henry Hill, a man whose life depended on staying anonymous, couldn't resist telling people who he really was. He'd get drunk in bars and start bragging about his mob connections. He'd tell women he was trying to impress that he was Henry Hill from Goodfellas. He was literally putting himself and his family in danger because he couldn't handle being anonymous. By 1987, just 7 years after entering witness protection, Henry Hill's behavior had become so problematic that the Marshal Service kicked him out of the program. This is extremely rare. The whole point of WITSEC is to protect cooperating witnesses. But Henry was such a liability that they concluded he wasn't worth protecting anymore. They gave him some money, wished him luck, and told him he was on his own. Karen divorced him around this time. Can you blame her? She'd spent years in witness protection, living in fear, raising their kids in secrecy, all because Henry had cooperated with the FBI. And what was Henry doing? Getting drunk, getting arrested, and telling strangers who he was. Karen took the kids and disappeared into witness protection on her own. She's still there, living under an assumed name, and she hasn't spoken publicly since the 1990s. Meanwhile, Henry spent the rest of his life as a minor celebrity exploiting his own past. After being kicked out of witness protection, Henry Hill became a public figure. He sold his story. He worked with Nicholas Pileggi on the book Wise Guy, which became the basis for Goodfellas. He made money from the book and the movie, and then he spent the next 20 years doing media appearances, giving interviews, and generally cashing in on his notoriety. He appeared on the Howard Stern show multiple times, usually drunk or high, telling stories about the old days. He did speaking tours. He sold his autograph at memorabilia shows. He even started a website selling Henry Hill's Sunday gravy pasta sauce. Using his mob past to sell spaghetti sauce, it was pathetic and exploitative, and it showed you exactly who Henry Hill really was. A man with no shame and no remorse. But the really dark part? He kept getting arrested. In 1987, he was arrested for drug possession, cocaine. In 1996, he was arrested for drunk driving. In 2001, he was arrested for drug possession again. In 2005, he was arrested for public intoxication and disorderly conduct. Every few years, there'd be another arrest. Another embarrassing mugshot in the tabloids. This was a man who'd been given a second chance, a new identity, a clean slate, witness protection, and he'd thrown it all away. Henry Hill's children, Greg and Gina, have both spoken about growing up with him as a father, and their accounts are heartbreaking. Greg Hill wrote a book called On the Run, A Mafia Childhood, describing what it was like to be Henry Hill's son. Constant fear, constantly moving, constantly lying about who they were, and then watching their father destroy himself with drugs and alcohol. Both children eventually cut off contact with Henry. They wanted nothing to do with him. In his final years, Henry Hill was broke. He'd made money from Goodfellas and from various media appearances, but he'd spent it all on drugs, alcohol, and legal fees. He was living in California, in a modest apartment. Estranged from his children and most of his family, he was still doing occasional interviews and appearances, still telling the same old stories, still trying to squeeze a few more dollars out of his past. Henry Hill died on June 12, 2012, at the age of 69. The cause of death was complications from heart disease, exacerbated by decades of drug and alcohol abuse. He died at a hospital in Los Angeles. There was no mob funeral, no big send-off, just a quiet death, largely unnoticed except by true crime enthusiasts and Goodfellas fans. His death barely made the news. There were a few obituaries in major newspapers, mostly focused on his role in Goodfellas rather than his actual life. The New York Times ran a brief piece. Some crime websites covered it, but mostly the world just shrugged. Henry Hill, the man who'd lived for attention and validation, died with hardly anyone noticing. So that's the real Henry Hill. Not Ray Liotta's charming hustler, not the quick-witted narrator who makes crime look fun. The real Henry Hill was a violent criminal who destroyed everyone who ever trusted him. A drug addict who couldn't stay sober even when his life depended on it. A narcissist who exploited his own criminal past for minor celebrity. And a man who died alone and broke after burning every bridge he'd ever built. The movie ends with Henry complaining that he has to live like a schnook now. But the truth is, Henry Hill was always a schnook. He just didn't realize it. Now let's talk about the man in the movie called Jimmy Conway, played by Robert De Niro, as a sort of tragic father figure who cared deeply about his crew, but got corrupted by greed. The real man, James Burke, known as Jimmy the Gent, was nothing like that portrayal. He was one of the most prolific murderers in American Mafia history. A stone-cold psychopath who killed with such frequency and such casual brutality that even other mobsters were terrified of him. James Burke was born on July 5, 1931, in New York City, and right from the start, his life was marked by violence and abandonment. His parents were not involved in his upbringing. His father was absent, and his mother gave him up when he was just 2 years old. He was placed in foster care, and what happened to him there set the trajectory for the rest of his life. Burke went through multiple foster homes throughout his childhood, and many of them were abusive. We're talking about severe physical abuse, beatings, starvation, neglect. There are documented reports that Burke was hospitalized multiple times as a child due to injuries from his foster parents. This was the 1930s and early 1940s, when child welfare services were minimal and foster care was barely regulated. Children in the system were often treated like indentured servants or worse. Psychologists who later examined Burke's case noted that he displayed all the classic signs of a psychopath from an early age: lack of empathy, inability to form genuine emotional connections, fascination with violence, and a complete absence of remorse. These traits can be genetic, but they're also heavily influenced by childhood trauma. Burke experienced the worst kind of childhood trauma, and it created a monster. By his teens, Burke was already committing serious crimes. His first arrest came at age 16 for robbery. Then came assault, then burglary. By the time he was 20, he'd already served time in a juvenile facility and was well known to New York City police. But here's where his life took a turn that would define everything that came after. He got involved with the Lucchese crime family. Burke couldn't be a made man. He was Irish, not Italian. But he became a highly valued associate. Why? Because he was willing to do things other people wouldn't. He was willing to commit violence without hesitation. He was willing to kill, and he was smart about it. Burke wasn't some hothead who killed in fits of rage. He was calculating. He planned his murders carefully. He made people disappear so completely that their bodies were never found. The nickname Jimmy the Gent sounds charming, doesn't it? It makes you think of a gentleman mobster, someone with class and style. The movie leans into this. De Niro's character is always well-dressed, always composed. But the real origin of that nickname was darkly ironic. Burke got the nickname because he was exceptionally polite to his victims before he killed them. He'd be charming, friendly, put them at ease, and then he'd murder them. It was a joke among other criminals, a sardonic acknowledgement of his two-faced nature. In the 1960s and early 1970s, Burke became the primary hijacking expert for the Lucchese family's operations at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. This is a crucial detail that the movie doesn't fully explain. JFK Airport was a gold mine for organized crime. Every day, millions of dollars worth of goods would come through that airport. Jewelry, electronics, cash, drugs, you name it. And Burke figured out how to steal it. He had connections with airport workers, truck drivers, security guards, and cargo handlers. He'd get tipped off about valuable shipments. And then he'd organize hijackings. Sometimes the drivers were in on it. They'd get a cut for pretending they were robbed. Other times, they weren't. And Burke's crew would use violence to take what they wanted. Burke made millions from these operations, millions. And he was smart enough to keep the bosses happy by giving them their cut. But here's what made Burke truly dangerous. He was paranoid, and he solved his paranoia by killing people. Every hijacking involved multiple people. Lookouts, drivers, the guys who actually did the robbery. The people who fenced the stolen goods. Every person involved was a potential witness. And Burke's solution was simple. Kill them all. Let me give you a specific example. In 1970, Burke and his crew robbed a freight terminal at JFK, stealing over $400,000 worth of clothing and other goods. 7 people were directly involved in the robbery. Over the next 6 months, 5 of those 7 people turned up dead. 2 were shot, 1 was strangled, 2 simply disappeared and were never found. The remaining 2 survivors lived in constant fear, never knowing if they'd be next. This was Burke's pattern. Plan a robbery, execute it, kill everyone involved. Keep the money. It was efficient, and it was terrifying. And the Lucchese family leadership loved him for it, because he made them money and eliminated witnesses at the same time. Burke wasn't just a criminal. He was a murder machine running on cold calculation. Henry Hill worked closely with Burke for years. And in interviews after the movie came out, Henry would sometimes slip and admit things that revealed just how dangerous Burke really was. In one interview, Henry said, "Jimmy would kill you for looking at him wrong. I saw him beat a guy nearly to death because the guy bumped into him in a bar. Didn't apologize fast enough. Jimmy just started hitting him. And he didn't stop until the guy was unconscious and bleeding on the floor. And then Jimmy straightened his tie, ordered another drink, and went back to his conversation like nothing happened." That's not in the movie. The movie shows you Jimmy Conway as this thoughtful, strategic criminal who only kills when absolutely necessary. The real Jimmy Burke killed when he felt like it. He killed over debts of a few $100s. He killed people who disrespected him. He killed people who knew too much. He killed people who might become problems later. His body count is estimated at over 50 people, though the exact number will never be known, because many of his victims were never found. Here's one of the most disturbing cases connected to Burke. In 1979, he murdered a young man named Richard Eaton. Eaton was the son of a man named Robert Eaton, who was a friend of Burke's. Richard Eaton had gotten into debt. He owed Burke money for drugs. The amount? About $8,000. That's it, $8,000. Richard couldn't pay, so he went into hiding. Burke tracked him down, and here's where it gets really dark. Burke didn't just kill Richard Eaton quickly. He tortured him first. He wanted information about where Richard had hidden some stolen jewelry. Richard gave up the information, thinking maybe Burke would let him go. Burke took the jewelry, and then murdered Richard anyway. His body was found weeks later, badly decomposed, with evidence of severe trauma before death. When Robert Eaton, Richard's father, found out his son was dead, he knew Burke was responsible, but what could he do? He was just a regular guy, not connected to the Mafia. If he went to the police, he'd have to admit his son was involved in crime. And even then, proving Burke did it would be nearly impossible. So Robert Eaton did nothing. He buried his son and lived with the knowledge that his son's killer would never face justice. That's the kind of fear Burke inspired. The movie shows Jimmy Conway becoming paranoid after the Lufthansa heist, killing people left and right because he's worried they'll talk. That's based in reality, but it undersells the situation. Burke didn't just kill people involved in the heist. He killed their associates. He killed people who'd merely heard about the heist. He went on a murder spree that lasted months and left bodies scattered across New York and New Jersey. But before we get to Lufthansa, let me tell you about Burke's family life, because it adds another layer to how disturbed this man was. Burke married a woman named Mickey in the early 1960s. They had children together, and to the outside world, he played the role of a family man. He'd go home at night. He'd have dinner with his kids. He'd help with homework, and then he'd go out and murder someone. Come home with blood on his clothes, and act like nothing was wrong. His son, Jesse James Burke, followed in his father's footsteps and became involved in organized crime. Jesse was eventually convicted of drug trafficking and is currently serving time in federal prison. The Burke criminal legacy spans generations, a family business of violence and theft. Burke's wife Mickey knew what he did for a living, but she kept quiet. In the Mafia world, wives were expected to ask no questions and see nothing. Mickey played that role perfectly. She enjoyed the money, the lifestyle, the respect that came with being Jimmy Burke's wife. And she looked the other way when bodies started piling up. Now, here's something that's absolutely crucial to understanding Burke's relationship with Henry Hill. Burke didn't trust Henry, ever. He used Henry. He worked with Henry. They made money together for years. But Burke always suspected that Henry would eventually become a rat. And he was right. After Henry got arrested on drug charges in 1980, Burke's first instinct was to kill him. Just eliminate the problem before it became a problem. Burke had killed people for less. But Henry was in custody, under federal protection, and there was no easy way to get to him. So Burke waited, hoping Henry would keep his mouth shut while preparing contingencies in case he didn't. When Burke found out Henry was cooperating with the FBI, he was furious, but not surprised. He'd seen it coming. And if Burke had been able to get to Henry at that point, Henry would have died slowly and painfully. Burke didn't just kill rats. He made examples of them. But Henry was untouchable in witness protection. So Burke had to settle for murdering anyone he suspected might also cooperate. This brings us to Burke's eventual downfall. Despite being suspected in dozens of murders, Burke was incredibly careful. He didn't leave evidence. He didn't talk on phones that could be tapped. He used multiple intermediaries for his crimes, for years. The FBI knew Burke was a killer, but couldn't prove it in court. They had suspicions. They had circumstantial evidence, but nothing concrete enough for a conviction. But Burke made one critical mistake. He murdered Richard Eaton, and he did it in a way that left evidence. The body was found. The cause of death was clear. And when Henry Hill started cooperating, he gave the FBI details about the Eaton murder that only someone with inside knowledge would know. The FBI was finally able to build a case. In 1985, James Burke was convicted of murder for the Richard Eaton killing. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. He was sent to Wend Correctional Facility in upstate New York, and that's where he would spend the rest of his life. But even in prison, Burke was dangerous. He continued to run criminal operations from behind bars. He had people on the outside who would carry out his orders. He maintained his connections to the Lucchese family, and he made it very clear to everyone that if anyone cooperated with authorities, he would have them killed, no matter how long it took. Burke was later convicted of additional charges related to the Lufthansa heist and other crimes, which added more time to his sentence. By the early 1990s, it was clear he would die in prison. And that's exactly what happened. James Burke died on April 13, 1996. At the age of 64, the cause of death was lung cancer. He died at Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo, New York, while still in custody. He'd spent his final years in a prison hospital, his body ravaged by cancer, his once powerful frame reduced to a skeletal shadow. There was no funeral. The family kept it private. Burke was cremated, and his ashes were disposed of quietly. Even in death, he was divisive. Some saw him as a legendary criminal, others as a remorseless monster. But one thing is certain. James Burke was responsible for the deaths of dozens of people, and he never showed a moment of remorse for any of them. Here's something that's bothered me since researching this story. Burke was suspected in over 50 murders, but he was only ever convicted of one. Think about that. 50 people dead, and he only faced justice for a single killing. All those families, parents, children, siblings, spouses, who lost someone they loved. And Burke never had to answer for it. That's the real tragedy here. Not that Burke died in prison, but that he got away with so much for so long. The movie shows Jimmy Conway as this conflicted, almost sympathetic character. De Niro plays him with depth and nuance, making you understand his motivations, even if you don't agree with them. And look, it's a brilliant performance. De Niro is phenomenal, but the character in the movie bears almost no resemblance to the real James Burke. The real Burke wasn't conflicted about violence. He enjoyed it. He wasn't driven by greed alone. He was driven by power, by the high of dominating others, by the satisfaction of instilling fear. He wasn't a father figure to his crew. He was a tyrant who would murder them the moment they became inconvenient. And he wasn't brought down by bad luck or paranoia. He was brought down because he underestimated how many people he'd hurt and how many witnesses would eventually line up to testify against him. If there's one thing I want you to understand about James Burke, it's this. He represents the darkest aspects of organized crime. Not the glamour, not the loyalty, not the honor among thieves that movies like to portray. Burke represents the brutal truth, that the Mafia was built on violence, extortion, and the willingness to destroy anyone who got in the way. And Burke was very, very good at his job. Now we need to talk about Tommy DeSimone, because this is where things get truly disturbing. Joe Pesci won an Academy Award for playing Tommy DeVito in Goodfellas. It's an iconic performance. Funny, terrifying, unpredictable. The funny how scene is one of the most famous in cinema history. But Pesci's performance, as brilliant as it was, only captured about 10% of how truly psychotic Tommy DeSimone really was. Thomas DeSimone was born on May 24, 1950, in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but he grew up in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn. Unlike Henry Hill and Jimmy Burke, who came from difficult backgrounds, Tommy came from what you might call Mafia royalty. His uncles were members of the Lucchese crime family. His brother was involved in organized crime. This wasn't a kid who fell into the mob life. He was born into it. Tommy's father died when Tommy was young, and he was raised primarily by his mother and his older siblings. But the male role models in his life were all criminals. He grew up hearing stories about heists, murders, and mafia politics at the dinner table. By the time he was a teenager, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with his life. He wanted to be a made man. He wanted to be inducted into the Lucchese family like his uncles. He wanted power and respect, but there was a problem. Tommy DeSimone was a psychopath. Not in the Hollywood sense, where every violent criminal gets labeled a psychopath. In the clinical sense, multiple psychologists who've studied the case have concluded that DeSimone exhibited classic psychopathic traits: superficial charm, lack of empathy, impulsivity, grandiosity, and a complete inability to feel remorse. DeSimone started committing crimes young. His first arrest came when he was a teenager. Burglary, then assault. He was building a record. But unlike most young criminals who'd get scared straight after their first stint in jail, DeSimone seemed to enjoy it. He liked the reputation. He liked the fear he inspired. And most disturbingly, he liked violence for its own sake. In his late teens and early 20s, DeSimone became associated with the Vario crew, working alongside Henry Hill and Jimmy Burke. And this is where his reputation really started to grow. Because while Hill was a hustler and Burke was a calculated killer, DeSimone was something else entirely. He was unpredictable. He was violent without reason. He would kill people over the smallest slights. Let me give you a specific example that's not in the movie, but is absolutely documented. In 1970, DeSimone was in a bar in Queens. He got into an argument with a man. The kind of stupid drunk argument that happens in bars all the time. Something about sports or a woman or who knows what. The man said something that DeSimone perceived as disrespectful. DeSimone waited until the man went to the bathroom, followed him in, and beat him so badly that the man spent 3 weeks in the hospital with a fractured skull, broken ribs, and internal bleeding. The victim went to the police. He identified DeSimone, but when it came time to testify, he suddenly couldn't remember who'd attacked him. Why? Because members of the Vario crew had visited him in the hospital and explained what would happen to him and his family if he cooperated. The charges were dropped. DeSimone walked away, and the message was clear. You don't cross Tommy, and you definitely don't testify against him. Now let's talk about the murders, because this is where it gets really dark. The movie shows Tommy DeVito killing 2 people. Spider, a young kid working at a card game, and Billy Batts, a made man in the Gambino family. Both of these murders really happened, though the details are even more disturbing than what the movie showed. Let's start with Spider. His real name was Michael Chunko, and he was a teenager, probably around 16 or 17 years old. Working as a general assistant for the Vario crew, he'd fetch drinks, clean up, run errands, that kind of thing. The movie portrays him as just a kid trying to make some money. That's accurate. The incident with Spider really happened. DeSimone really did shoot him in the foot, supposedly as a joke, or because he wasn't moving fast enough. Spider recovered from that injury and went back to work because he needed the money, and because refusing would have been seen as disrespectful. A few weeks later, during another card game, Spider made the mistake of talking back to DeSimone. According to Henry Hill's account, Spider said something like, "Why don't you go fuck yourself, Tommy?" Everyone at the table froze, because you didn't talk to Tommy DeSimone like that. What happened next is documented in multiple sources. DeSimone pulled out a gun and shot Spider multiple times, killing him, just like that, over an insult from a teenager. And here's the most chilling part. After killing Spider, DeSimone looked around the room at the other guys and said something along the lines of, "What?" He was being disrespectful, as if that justified murder. Jimmy Burke was at that card game. Henry Hill was there. Other members of the crew were there, and not one of them intervened. Not because they thought Spider deserved to die, but because nobody wanted to be Tommy's next victim. They helped dispose of the body, reportedly buried it in the basement of a building owned by Burke, and they never spoke about it again. Spider's family never knew what happened to him. He just disappeared. Now let's talk about Billy Batts, because this is one of the most infamous murders in Mafia history. William Benvena, known as Billy Batts, was a made man in the Gambino crime family. That's important. A made man is untouchable. You can't kill a made man without permission from the bosses. It's one of the cardinal rules of the Mafia. Breaking that rule means you die. The movie shows the Billy Batts murder happening in one night. He insults Tommy at the bar by bringing up Tommy's past as a shoeshine boy. Tommy and Jimmy beat him to death, and they bury him. The real story was even more brutal. It happened on June 11th, 1970. Billy Batts had just gotten out of prison and was celebrating at a bar called the Suite in Queens. Tommy DeSimone was there. According to multiple accounts, Batts did make a joke about Tommy shining shoes as a kid. This was apparently true. Tommy had shined shoes to make money when he was young, and he was deeply sensitive about it. But here's what the movie doesn't show. DeSimone didn't just lose his temper and beat Batts to death in a rage. He planned it after the initial confrontation at the bar. DeSimone and Burke lured Batts to a different location, Robert's Lounge, one of their hangouts. They told him they were going to another party. Batts, who'd been drinking, went along. Once they got Batts to Robert's Lounge, DeSimone attacked him with a tire iron. Burke joined in. They beat him viciously. And here's the truly disturbing part. They didn't kill him right away. Batts was still alive when they put him in the trunk of a car. He was still alive when they drove him to an undisclosed location. According to some accounts, he was still alive when they buried him. They literally buried the man alive. Henry Hill confirmed this in later interviews, though he tried to downplay his own involvement. He claimed he just helped dig the hole and wasn't present for the beating. But FBI documents suggest Hill was more involved than he admitted. Either way, the murder of Billy Batts was one of the most brutal killings in Mafia history, and it sealed Tommy DeSimone's fate. Because here's what happens when you kill a made man without permission. The bosses find out. And when they find out, you die. It doesn't matter how connected you are. It doesn't matter how many people you've killed. You broke the ultimate rule, and you pay the ultimate price. But DeSimone didn't die immediately. It took years. Why? Because the Gambino family, that's his family, wanted to be sure they had the right people before they retaliated. They investigated, they asked questions, and they waited for the perfect opportunity. In the meantime, DeSimone continued committing murders. The exact number is unknown, but he's suspected in at least 10 killings between 1970 and 1979. Some were mafia business, people who owed money, people who were informants, people who disrespected the family. But others were just Tommy being Tommy, killing because he felt like it, killing because someone looked at him wrong, killing because he was a psychopath who enjoyed violence. Here's a story that never made it into the movie. In the mid-1970s, DeSimone was involved in a robbery at a truck depot. One of the truck drivers recognized him and called him by name. DeSimone shot him in the head right there. No hesitation, the driver died instantly. And when the other robbers asked Tommy why he'd done it, he said, "He knew my name," as if that was sufficient reason to end a man's life. There's another incident that's even more disturbing, and Henry Hill only admitted to it years after Goodfellas came out. In the late 1970s, Tommy DeSimone raped Henry Hill's wife, Karen. Yes, you read that correctly. While Henry was out of town on business, DeSimone went to Henry's house and sexually assaulted Karen. Karen was terrified to tell Henry at first, because she knew what would happen. If Henry confronted Tommy, Tommy would kill Henry. Or Tommy would kill Karen, or both. So she kept quiet for weeks. When she finally told Henry, he was faced with an impossible situation. He couldn't go to the police. That would be seen as betraying the crew. He couldn't confront Tommy directly. That would get him killed. So Henry did nothing. He just swallowed his rage and humiliation and continued working alongside the man who'd raped his wife. Think about that for a minute. This is the reality of mob life that the movie doesn't show you. There's no honor. There's no loyalty. Just fear and violence and predatory behavior. And the strong prey on the weak without consequences. Henry confirmed this incident in a radio interview years later. He said it was one of the reasons he ultimately cooperated with the FBI. Not the main reason, but part of his growing resentment toward the crew. He'd spent years protecting Tommy, covering for Tommy, making money with Tommy. And Tommy had raped his wife. That's the kind of man Tommy DeSimone was. Now, let's talk about why Tommy DeSimone was never made. This is shown in the movie. Tommy's expecting to be inducted into the family, but instead he gets killed. But the movie simplifies the reasons in reality. There were multiple factors working against DeSimone. First, the Billy Batts murder. The bosses knew about it, and they weren't happy. You can't kill a made man from another family and expect no consequences. Second, DeSimone's behavior was becoming a liability. He was too violent, too unpredictable, too likely to bring heat from law enforcement. Third, and this is crucial, there were rumors that DeSimone was a drug addict. He was using cocaine heavily by the late 1970s, and the bosses didn't trust addicts. But there was one more factor that sealed his fate. He killed another made man. The victim's name was Foxy Jareth, a member of the Gambino family. The circumstances of this murder are murky. Different sources give different accounts, but the general consensus is that DeSimone and Jareth got into a dispute over money or territory, and DeSimone shot him. This was the final straw. The Gambino family, which was one of the most powerful mafia families in New York, demanded justice. They went to the leadership of the Lucchese family and said, essentially, you need to handle this, or we will. The Lucchese bosses had a choice. Protect Tommy DeSimone, a violent psychopath who was becoming more trouble than he was worth, or sacrifice him to maintain peace with the Gambinos. They chose to sacrifice him. On January 14th, 1979, Tommy DeSimone was called to what he thought was his induction ceremony. He thought he was finally going to become a made man. He got dressed up, He was excited, according to some accounts. He was even practicing what he was going to say during the ceremony. He went to a house in Queens where the ceremony was supposedly taking place. He walked into the house, and he never walked out. What exactly happened in that house is unknown. There are various theories. The most common story is that DeSimone was shot in the back of the head as soon as he entered. Quick, clean, professional. But other accounts suggest he was beaten first, made to understand why he was dying before they killed him. Some claim he was tortured as revenge for the brutal way he'd killed Billy Batts. We'll never know for sure because his body was never found. Tommy DeSimone disappeared on January 14, 1979, and he's never been seen since. He's presumed dead, though he was never officially declared dead until years later for legal purposes. He was 28 years old. His mother spent years trying to find out what happened to her son. She hired private investigators. She begged the police for information. She reached out to members of the Mafia, pleading for someone to tell her where her son was buried, so she could at least give him a proper funeral. Nobody would tell her anything, to this day. Tommy DeSimone's burial location remains unknown. Henry Hill later said that he was told DeSimone had been murdered in retaliation for the Billy Batts killing, and that Jimmy Burke knew about it in advance, but didn't warn Tommy. Burke apparently decided that losing Tommy was a small price to pay for maintaining good relations with the Gambino family. That's the kind of loyalty that exists in the mob. Here's what's really disturbing about the Tommy DeSimone story. He's become almost mythical in mob lore. People watch Goodfellas and think, wow, Tommy is such a great character. They quote his lines. They imitate Joe Pesci's performance, but they're celebrating a rapist and a serial killer. They're romanticizing a man who murdered at least 10 people, many of them for no reason beyond personal satisfaction. Tommy DeSimone wasn't a lovable psycho. He wasn't a complex anti-hero. He was a remorseless killer who inflicted pain and terror for nearly a decade before being executed by his own people. And the fact that his story has been turned into entertainment, that people laugh at his jokes and admire his toughness, says something dark about our culture's relationship with violence. Joe Pesci's performance is brilliant. I'm not criticizing the movie or the actor, but we need to remember that the character is based on a real person who caused real suffering. The families of Michael Junko, Billy Batts, Foxy Jareth, and all the other people DeSimone killed don't think he's funny or cool. They think he's a monster, and they're right. One final note about Tommy DeSimone. In the years since his disappearance, there have been occasional rumors that he didn't die in 1979, that he actually survived and went into hiding, possibly with help from some faction of the Mafia. These rumors pop up every few years, usually on mob-related forums or in true crime communities. But these rumors are almost certainly false. The Mafia doesn't let someone like DeSimone just walk away. He knew too much. He'd killed too many people, and he'd broken too many rules. The chances that he's alive somewhere are infinitesimally small. Tommy DeSimone is dead. He's been dead since January 1979. He was murdered by the same criminal organization he'd spent his entire life trying to join. That's his legacy. Now we need to talk about the crime that ties everything together. The Lufthansa heist of December 11, 1978. This was the biggest cash robbery in American history at the time, and it set off a chain of events that would destroy the Vario crew and lead to Henry Hill's cooperation with the FBI. The movie shows you the heist, but it simplifies it significantly. In reality, the planning and execution of this robbery involved months of preparation, dozens of people, and a level of sophistication that most criminals could never achieve. This wasn't a smash-and-grab job. This was a carefully orchestrated operation that required inside information, precise timing, and nerves of steel. Here's how it really happened. The target was the Lufthansa cargo terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens, New York. Lufthansa is a German airline, and in the late 1970s, they were handling enormous amounts of currency, moving between the United States and Europe. American dollars being sent to Germany, German marks being brought to America, all of it flowing through their cargo facility at JFK. The key to the whole operation was a man named Louis Werner. He was a cargo supervisor at Lufthansa, and he was in massive debt. He owed money to loan sharks, specifically loan sharks connected to the Vario crew. Werner was desperate. He was facing financial ruin, possibly violence if he couldn't pay his debts. So he made a decision that would change his life. He agreed to provide inside information about the cash shipments in exchange for getting his debts forgiven and receiving a cut of the proceeds. Werner approached a man named Martin Krugman, who was a bookie and an associate of the Vario crew. Krugman brought the information to Henry Hill. Hill brought it to Jimmy Burke. And Burke immediately understood the potential. This wasn't just a big score. This was generational wealth. The kind of money that could set you up for life, according to Werner's information. On the night of December 11th, 1978, there would be approximately $2 million in cash and another $4 million in jewelry and other valuables in the Lufthansa cargo vault. The vault was secure, but Werner provided detailed information about security procedures, the timing of guard shifts, and how to bypass certain alarms. With the right team and the right timing, it was doable. Burke spent months planning the heist. He assembled a crew of about 10 people, each with a specific role. There were drivers, lookouts, the guys who would actually enter the vault, and people responsible for disposing of evidence afterward. Burke planned every detail. What they'd wear, what they'd say, how long they'd stay, how they'd transport the money afterward. One crucial element was that everyone involved had to be trustworthy. They couldn't have anyone who might panic or make a mistake or talk to the wrong people. Burke handpicked his crew, choosing people he'd worked with before, people who'd proven they could keep their mouths shut. And ominously, Burke made sure he knew where everyone lived, where their families were, what leverage he had over them if things went wrong. On the night of December 11th, 1978, the plan went into action at approximately 3 a.m., when the facility would be least staffed and security would be at its most relaxed. The crew entered the Lufthansa cargo terminal. They were wearing masks and carrying guns. They quickly subdued the handful of workers who were present, zip-tied their hands, and forced them to lie on the floor. Here's where Louis Werner's inside information proved critical. The robbers knew exactly where to go and exactly how to access the vault. They knew which guards to target first. They knew where the cameras were and how to avoid them. They knew the combination to the outer vault door because Werner had provided it. The robbery took about an hour. The crew loaded duffel bags and boxes with cash and jewelry. The workers were terrified, but cooperative. Nobody wanted to be a hero and get shot. The robbers were professional and efficient. They didn't waste time. They didn't engage in unnecessary violence. And they stuck to the plan. When they left the terminal, they took several of the workers' coats and personal belongings to create the impression that maybe this was an inside job by one of the workers rather than an organized crew from outside. It was a smart misdirection that bought them valuable time before law enforcement realized this was a professional hit. The total haul? Approximately $5 million in cash and $875,000 in jewelry in $1,978. This was an astronomical amount of money. Adjusted for inflation, it's equivalent to roughly $25 to $30 million today. It was the biggest cash robbery in American history, and it made national headlines immediately. But here's where everything went wrong. The plan after the heist was simple. Lay low. Don't spend the money conspicuously. Don't talk about it. Don't do anything to attract attention. Burke had specifically told everyone involved, take your cut, put it away, and don't touch it for at least a year. Don't buy new cars. Don't take expensive vacations. Don't tell your wives. Just sit on the money and wait. Almost immediately, people started violating these instructions. One crew member bought a pink Cadillac, a brand new Cadillac, paid for in cash, just days after the heist. Another bought a huge amount of jewelry for his girlfriend. Another took his family on an expensive Florida vacation. These people had spent their entire lives struggling financially, and suddenly they had hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. They couldn't help themselves. They had to spend it. Burke was furious. Because every flashy purchase was evidence. Every new car, every expensive watch, every sudden lifestyle change was a breadcrumb for law enforcement to follow. And the FBI was already all over this case. A $6 million robbery at JFK Airport? This was a federal investigation from day one. With dozens of agents working around the clock to solve it, the FBI quickly identified Louis Werner as a likely inside man. His financial records showed he was deeply in debt, and his behavior after the heist was suspicious. Within weeks, they'd arrested him. Werner initially tried to play dumb, but the evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. But Werner didn't give up on the crew. He could have cut a deal, could have named names, could have testified against Burke and the others. But he kept his mouth shut. Why? Because he knew what happened to people who talked. He'd seen enough mob violence to know that cooperation meant death, either for him or for his family. So he went to prison and said nothing. Burke, however, couldn't take that chance. He couldn't trust that Werner would stay quiet forever. And he definitely couldn't trust the other crew members, who were already proving themselves to be idiots by spending their money so conspicuously. So Burke made a decision. Kill everyone involved over the next year. From late 1978 through 1979, Burke orchestrated what can only be described as a murder spree. One by one, the people involved in the Lufthansa heist started disappearing or turning up dead. Martin Krugman, the bookie who'd brought the heist information to Burke, disappeared in January 1979. His body has never been found, but he's presumed dead. Burke killed him to tie up loose ends. Richard Eaton, the young man we discussed earlier, whose murder Burke was eventually convicted for, was killed in December 1979. He wasn't directly involved in the heist, but he knew people who were, and Burke considered him a risk. Joseph "Joe" Buddha Mandry was found dead in the front seat of his car in May 1979. Shot in the head. He'd been a driver for the heist crew. Paolo Licastri, another crew member, was found dead in a garage in Brooklyn, shot multiple times. Thomas, Two-Gun Tommy DeSimone, yes, Tommy, was murdered in January 1979, though technically this was related to the Billy Bats murder rather than Lufthansa, but the timing is suspicious. And some investigators believe Burke gave DeSimone up to the Gambino family in part to reduce the number of people who knew about Lufthansa. The list goes on. Different sources give different numbers, but it's estimated that at least 8 people connected to the Lufthansa heist were murdered in the year following the robbery. Burke was systematically eliminating anyone who could implicate him, and it almost worked. Here's the truly chilling part. Burke didn't do most of these murders himself. He contracted them out. He'd tell someone, "I need you to handle this problem," and they'd handle it. Sometimes he'd use people from outside the crew, people who didn't know about Lufthansa, and therefore couldn't connect the murders to the heist. Burke was creating a buffer between himself and the violence, making it nearly impossible to link him directly to the killings. The FBI knew what was happening. They knew Burke was behind the murders. But knowing and proving are two different things. They couldn't get anyone to testify against him. Everyone was either dead or too terrified to talk. Burke had created a perfect storm of fear and violence that protected him. But then Henry Hill got arrested on drug charges in May 1980. And suddenly, the FBI had leverage. When Henry started cooperating, one of the first things he told them about was the Lufthansa heist. He gave them details about the planning, the execution, who was involved, and what happened afterward. He told them about the murders. He connected the dots between the robbery and the bodies. And suddenly, the FBI had a narrative that made sense. But even with Henry's testimony, prosecuting Burke for the Lufthansa heist was difficult. Most of the crew was dead. There was minimal physical evidence. Burke had been incredibly careful. In the end, Burke was never charged with the robbery itself, though he was charged with several of the related murders. The money from the Lufthansa heist was never fully recovered. Some of it was found, jewelry that was pawned, cash that was seized during arrests, but the vast majority disappeared. It's estimated that Burke kept around $3 to $4 million for himself. He hid it in various locations, invested some of it in legitimate businesses, and used some of it to fund other criminal operations. When Burke died in prison in 1996, he took the secret of where the money was hidden to his grave. There are rumors of safe deposit boxes, of money buried in remote locations, of cash hidden in the walls of buildings Burke owned. But none of it has ever been found. That money, millions of dollars in 1978 cash, is still out there somewhere, slowly deteriorating in whatever hiding place Burke chose. The Lufthansa heist fundamentally changed organized crime in America. It showed that even the most sophisticated robbery could be solved through informants and cooperation. It demonstrated that greed and paranoia would tear apart even the most disciplined crew. And it marked the beginning of the end for the old-school Mafia. As more and more mobsters chose cooperation over omerta, the code of silence, Henry Hill's decision to cooperate was directly linked to Lufthansa. He knew Burke would eventually kill him to protect the secret of the heist. He knew too much, and Burke didn't trust him. So when the FBI offered Henry a way out, he took it, and in doing so, he closed the book on one of the most infamous crimes in American history. But here's the thing that bothers me about how the Lufthansa heist is portrayed in popular culture. It's almost always shown as this awesome, legendary score. Movies and TV shows treat it like the ultimate heist, the dream job every criminal wishes they could pull off. And yeah, from a technical standpoint, it was brilliant. But look at what it actually accomplished. 8 people were murdered in the aftermath. Louis Werner went to prison. Jimmy Burke eventually went to prison and died there. Henry Hill destroyed his entire life and ended up broke and alone. The money was never enjoyed. It was either lost, seized, or spent on lawyer fees. And the families of the victims were destroyed. This wasn't a victimless crime. This wasn't some Robin Hood scenario where they stole from the rich. This was a violent robbery that led to a cascade of murders and ruined lives. So yeah, the Lufthansa heist was an impressive feat of criminal planning. But it was also a tragedy that destroyed everyone involved. That's the real story, not the myth, not the legend, the truth. Let's talk about something the movie only touches on superficially. The women in these men's lives. Because while Goodfellas does show Karen Hill and some of the other mob wives, it doesn't really dig into the reality of what it meant to be a woman connected to these criminals. And that reality was much darker and more complex than the movie suggests. Start with Karen Hill. In the movie, she's played by Lorraine Bracco as this strong, intelligent woman who gradually realizes what she's gotten herself into, but stays for the lifestyle, and because she loves Henry. That's partially true, but the real Karen Hill's story is more complicated. Karen Friedman was born into a middle-class Jewish family. She wasn't from the mob world. She met Henry in the mid-1960s when she was in her early 20s. And Henry swept her off her feet. He had money. He had style. He took her to nice restaurants and clubs. He introduced her to a world of excitement that her ordinary middle-class life didn't offer, and she fell for it. But here's what the movie doesn't adequately convey. Karen didn't just passively accept Henry's criminal lifestyle. She actively participated in it. When Henry needed someone to hide guns, Karen hid them. When he needed someone to carry money across state lines, Karen did it. When he needed someone to lie to the FBI, Karen lied. She wasn't just a mob wife. She was an accomplice. In interviews years later, Karen tried to portray herself as a victim of circumstances, as a woman who was trapped by love and fear, and there's some truth to that. She was certainly afraid of what would happen if she left Henry, or if she cooperated with authorities. But Karen also enjoyed the money and the lifestyle. She liked the expensive clothes, the jewelry, the nice house. She liked the respect that came with being Henry Hill's wife. She made choices, and those choices came with consequences. When Henry got arrested in 1980 and agreed to cooperate with the FBI, Karen had a decision to make. She could refuse to enter witness protection, take the kids, and try to build a normal life away from Henry. Or she could go with him, uproot her children's lives, and spend years looking over her shoulder. She chose to go with him. Life in witness protection was hard on Karen. The movie shows a bit of this. The boring suburban existence. The loss of identity, the constant fear, but it was worse than the movie depicts. Karen had to cut off all contact with her family, her parents, her siblings, her friends, everyone. She couldn't call them, couldn't write to them, couldn't let them know she was okay. For years, her family didn't know if she was alive or dead. And then there were Henry's continued betrayals. Even in witness protection, Henry was cheating on her. Even when they were supposed to be building a new life together, Henry was lying and using drugs and getting arrested. Karen stayed with him through all of this, until finally she couldn't anymore. Karen divorced Henry sometime in the late 1980s, or early 1990s. The exact date isn't public. After the divorce, she went back into witness protection under a different identity, taking her children with her, and unlike Henry, Karen actually followed the rules. She kept quiet. She didn't do interviews. She didn't exploit her story. She just disappeared to this day. Karen Hill's whereabouts are unknown. She's living somewhere in America under an assumed name. Her children, Greg and Gina, have both spoken publicly about their experiences, though they're careful not to reveal anything that could identify their mother's location. Karen chose anonymity and safety over fame and money. In that sense, she learned from Henry's mistakes. But we shouldn't romanticize Karen Hill. She wasn't innocent. She knew what Henry did for a living. She knew people were being hurt. She knew money was being stolen. And she benefited from it for years. Yes, she was in a difficult situation. Yes, leaving might have put her in danger. But she still made choices that enabled and supported criminal activity. Now let's talk about the other women in the mob world. Because they don't get enough attention in these stories. There were the wives of the other crew members. Women married to Jimmy Burke, Tommy DeSimone, Paul Vario, and dozens of other criminals. What was their experience? For many of these women, it was a life of willful ignorance mixed with complicity. They knew their husbands were criminals, but they didn't ask questions. They enjoyed the money and the lifestyle, but they didn't want to know the details. It was a strange bargain. Financial security in exchange for moral blindness. Jimmy Burke's wife, Mickey, was a perfect example. She had to know what Jimmy did for a living. She had to know he was a killer. But she never asked, and Jimmy never told. They had an unspoken agreement. He'd provide for the family. And she wouldn't question how this arrangement worked for decades. Until Jimmy went to prison, and the money stopped coming. And then there were the mistresses. The movie shows Henry keeping an apartment for his mistress, Janice Rossi, and it shows the tension this creates with Karen. But the movie doesn't show you how common this was. Almost every member of the Vario crew had a wife and at least one mistress. Sometimes more. It was practically expected. Part of the mob lifestyle. These weren't sophisticated arrangements. The wives usually knew about the mistresses. The mistresses usually knew about the wives. Everyone just pretended not to know what everyone else knew. It was a bizarre, dysfunctional system built on lies and infidelity. And it worked, because everyone was getting something out of it. The mistresses got money and gifts and attention. The wives got stability and social status. The mobsters got to play the role of the powerful man with women on their arms. Everyone was using everyone else, and nobody wanted to acknowledge the emptiness of it all. Here's something dark that the movie completely ignores. Domestic violence. Many of these mob marriages were marked by physical abuse. Henry Hill hit Karen. She's confirmed this in interviews. Jimmy Burke was known to be violent with his wife. The culture of the Mafia was inherently violent, and that violence often extended into the home, but the wives couldn't go to the police. If a mob wife showed up at a police station with bruises and tried to file a domestic violence complaint, she'd be signing her own death warrant. The crew would see it as betrayal, and the consequences would be severe. So the abuse continued, hidden behind closed doors, never acknowledged publicly. There's also the issue of how these women raised children in this environment. Karen Hill raised 2 kids, Greg and Gina, while Henry was committing crimes and betraying the family. What was that like for those kids? Growing up knowing their father was a criminal? Watching their mother hide guns and lie to authorities? living with the constant fear that their father might get killed or arrested. Greg and Gina Hill have both written and spoken about their experiences, and their accounts are heartbreaking. They describe a childhood marked by fear, secrecy, and constant instability. They moved frequently. They were told not to trust anyone outside the family. They watched their father get arrested multiple times. They saw their mother's pain and frustration, and they couldn't talk about any of it with anyone. Then came witness protection, which somehow made things worse. Suddenly, they had to pretend to be different people. They had to lie about their past, their family, their entire history. They had to cut off contact with grandparents, cousins, friends, everyone. And they had to do all of this as children. Without fully understanding why, both of Henry Hill's children have said they've struggled with trust issues, anxiety, and the psychological trauma of their upbringing. They've both had to undergo therapy to process what they experienced. And they both cut off contact with Henry in his later years because they couldn't handle his continued dysfunction. This is what the movie doesn't show you: the generational trauma, the psychological damage that extends beyond the criminals themselves to their families and children. The mob lifestyle doesn't just destroy the mobsters, it destroys everyone around them. There's another category of women we need to discuss: the victims. Because while we're talking about wives and mistresses and children, we need to remember that many women were victimized by these men. They were beaten, raped, threatened, and terrorized. We already discussed Tommy DeSimone raping Karen Hill, but he wasn't the only sexual predator in the Vario crew. These were violent men who believed they could take whatever they wanted, including women's bodies, and the culture protected them. If a woman was assaulted by a mobster and tried to report it, she'd be intimidated into silence. The crew would threaten her family, and make it clear that cooperation meant death. How many women were assaulted by members of the Vario crew over the years? We'll never know. Most never reported it. Those who did were silenced. Their stories were never told. Their trauma never acknowledged. They're the invisible victims of organized crime. The women whose suffering doesn't make it into the movies or the books because it's too ugly, too uncomfortable, too real. Here's what I want you to understand about the women in this story. They weren't all innocent victims, but they also weren't villains. They were people stuck in an impossible situation, making difficult choices with limited options. Some of them were complicit in crime. Some of them were victims of violence. Most of them were both. Karen Hill spent years supporting Henry's criminal lifestyle, profiting from stolen money and helping him evade justice. She also spent years being cheated on, lied to, and eventually abandoned. She made bad choices, but she also suffered for those choices. Her story doesn't have a simple moral. The same is true for most of the women connected to the mob. They weren't passive participants in their own lives. They made choices, good and bad. They enabled crime, but they also endured abuse. They enjoyed the money, but they paid the price in fear and trauma. The movie shows you some of this complexity with Karen's character, but it doesn't go deep enough. It doesn't show you the full reality of what it meant to be a woman in the mob world. And it definitely doesn't show you the women who were victimized, but never had their stories told. So when you watch Goodfellas, remember, for every mobster on screen, there were wives, mistresses, daughters, and victims whose lives were destroyed. Their suffering is just as much a part of this story as the heists and the murders. We just don't talk about it as much, because it's not as cinematic. Let's talk about what happened after the dust settled. After Henry Hill cooperated, after the trials ended, after the witnesses were relocated and the criminals were imprisoned. Because the aftermath of this story is just as important as the events themselves. First, let's discuss the prosecutions that resulted from Henry Hill's cooperation. We've already mentioned that Paul Vario was convicted and died in prison in 1988, but Vario wasn't the only one. Henry's testimony led to dozens of arrests and convictions within the Lucchese crime family and associated organizations. The FBI used Henry's information to build cases against mobsters involved in everything from murder to hijacking, to drug trafficking, to loan sharking. Some of these cases took years to prosecute because the crimes Henry described had happened a decade or more earlier. But prosecutors were patient, and they were thorough. The impact on the Lucchese family was significant. The family didn't collapse entirely. Organized crime families are resilient organizations that can survive the loss of even key members. But the Vario crew specifically was decimated. Most of its members were either dead, in prison, or forced to retire from active crime due to the scrutiny. Jimmy Burke spent the rest of his life in prison. Dying in 1996, Paul Vario died in prison in 1988. Tommy DeSimone was murdered in 1979. Of the main players in the story, Henry Hill was the only one who survived and remained free. And even he spent his final years in poverty and addiction. But the story doesn't end there. Because organized crime doesn't end just because a few mobsters get arrested. The Lucchese family continued operating, adapting to new circumstances and new realities. And the lessons learned from the Vario crew's downfall were applied to future operations. The modern Lucchese family is much more careful about who they trust. They're more sophisticated about avoiding wiretaps and surveillance. They've diversified their criminal operations to reduce dependency on any single income source. And they've become more ruthless about eliminating informants before those informants can do damage. The legacy of Henry Hill's cooperation is that it made the Mafia more paranoid and more violent. It didn't end organized crime. It just changed how organized crime operates. That's the ironic tragedy of cooperation. It's supposed to dismantle criminal organizations, but often it just makes them adapt and evolve. Now, let's talk about the people who survived this story and where they are today. Karen Hill, as we've discussed, is somewhere in America, living under an assumed identity. She's chosen privacy and anonymity over public life. She hasn't done an interview since the 1990s. She hasn't written a book. She's not on social media. She's simply disappeared into normal American life, probably living in some suburb under a name that nobody would recognize. Greg and Gina Hill, Henry's children, have both been more public. Greg wrote a book called On the Run, A Mafia Childhood, published in 2004, which details his experience growing up as Henry Hill's son. It's a powerful, disturbing account of what it was like to live in constant fear, to constantly move, to constantly lie about who you were. Greg has done some interviews and speaking engagements, though he's careful about maintaining his privacy. Gina Hill has also written about her experiences and has done some media appearances. Both Greg and Gina have been open about the psychological toll of their upbringing and their complicated feelings toward their father. They loved him, but they also resented him for the choices he made and the danger he put them in. Both of Henry's children appear to have built relatively normal, law-abiding lives for themselves, though they've both acknowledged struggling with the legacy of their father's crimes. They've had to carry the weight of being Henry Hill's children while trying to establish their own identities separate from that history. As for the rest of the Vario crew, the ones who survived, most of them served prison time and then faded into obscurity. Some died in prison. Others were released and quietly retired from criminal life. A few continued committing crimes and were arrested again, but none of them achieved the level of notoriety that Henry Hill did through his cooperation and his connection to Goodfellas. The Lufthansa heist remains officially unsolved. While the FBI knows who committed the robbery based on Henry Hill's testimony, and while some people connected to it were convicted of related charges, nobody was ever convicted specifically for the robbery itself. The statute of limitations has long since expired, and most of the people involved are dead. It's one of the most famous unsolved crimes in American history. Even though everyone knows who did it, the money from the Lufthansa heist, the millions of dollars that Burke stole, has never been recovered. It's presumably hidden somewhere, slowly deteriorating in whatever location Burke chose. There are occasional news stories about people claiming to have found it, or to know where it is. But these always turn out to be hoaxes or misunderstandings. The money is gone, lost to time. In 2014, there was a break in the Lufthansa case when the FBI arrested Vincent Asaro, an elderly mobster who'd allegedly been involved in the heist. The arrest came after decades of investigation and was based on testimony from several cooperating witnesses. The case went to trial in 2015, and Asaro was acquitted of all charges. The jury simply didn't find the evidence compelling enough to convict an 80-year-old man of a crime that happened in 1978. This acquittal frustrated the FBI and prosecutors who'd spent years building the case. But it also illustrated a hard truth about prosecuting decades-old crimes. Witnesses die. Memories fade. Evidence disappears. Even when you know someone is guilty. Proving it in court is incredibly difficult. The legacy of the Goodfellas story extends beyond the specific people involved. It's influenced popular culture, law enforcement practices, and our understanding of organized crime. The movie itself has become one of the most celebrated films in cinema history, consistently ranking on lists of the greatest films ever made. But there's a dark side to this legacy, the glamorization of mob life. Despite the movie's ultimate message that crime doesn't pay, and that these men ended up dead or in prison or in witness protection, many viewers still come away thinking the mob life looks exciting and cool. They focus on the parties and the power and the money, and they downplay the violence and the betrayals and the misery. This is a problem that extends beyond just Goodfellas. Our culture has a complicated relationship with organized crime. We're fascinated by it. We make movies and TV shows about it. We turn mobsters into celebrities, but we often forget about the victims. The people who were robbed, beaten, murdered, or terrorized by these criminals. Every dollar Henry Hill and Jimmy Burke stole was taken from someone. Every person Tommy DeSimone killed had a family that mourned them. Every business that was shaken down for protection money had an owner who lived in fear. The human cost of organized crime is enormous, and it's not adequately represented in most popular depictions. So where are we now, decades after the events depicted in Goodfellas? Organized crime still exists, though it's changed significantly. The Italian-American Mafia is weaker than it was in the 1970s, diminished by decades of prosecutions, cooperation from informants, and competition from other criminal organizations. The five families of New York, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno, still exist, but they're shadows of their former selves. Many of their operations have been disrupted by law enforcement. Many of their leaders are in prison or under surveillance. And the culture of omerta, the code of silence, has been significantly eroded by the increasing willingness of mobsters to cooperate with authorities. The Lucchese family, specifically, has been particularly hard hit by defections and prosecutions. The damage done by Henry Hill's cooperation was compounded by subsequent cooperators, who continued to provide information to law enforcement. The family still operates, but at a much reduced level compared to their heyday in the 1970s and 1980s. One interesting development: the FBI has publicly stated that they believe the Lufthansa heist money, or at least most of it, will never be recovered. Jimmy Burke took that secret to his grave, and whoever else might know where the money is hidden has either died or isn't talking. It's likely that the cash has deteriorated beyond usability by now anyway, rotting away in whatever hiding place Burke chose. The real lesson of the Goodfellas story isn't about crime or punishment or justice. It's about betrayal. Everyone in this story betrayed someone. Henry betrayed his crew. Jimmy betrayed his crew members by killing them. Tommy betrayed basic human decency by murdering people for no reason. Karen betrayed her values by enabling Henry's crimes. The Mafia bosses betrayed their own rules by allowing drug dealing to proliferate. Everyone was a snake, and everyone got bitten. And what was it all for? Money that was never enjoyed. Power that was never real. Respect that was based on fear rather than admiration. These men spent their entire lives chasing something that didn't actually exist, the dream of the gangster life. The fantasy that the movie inadvertently reinforces is exactly that, a fantasy. The reality is prison, death, or witness protection. Those are the only three endings for people who choose that life. Henry Hill died broke and alone in 2012. Jimmy Burke died in prison in 1996. Tommy DeSimone was murdered in 1979. Paul Vario died in prison in 1988. Of all the major players in this story, not a single one got a happy ending. Not one. They all ended up either dead or imprisoned or living in fear. That's the reality of mob life. Now let's talk about the movie itself. What Martin Scorsese and screenwriter Nicholas Pileggi got right, what they changed, and why those changes matter. First, let's acknowledge what the movie did brilliantly. It captured the feel of mob life. The camaraderie, the paranoia, the violence, the mundane aspects of criminal life. Scorsese didn't make a typical Hollywood gangster movie where everything is glamorous and everyone speaks in tough guy cliches. He made something that felt real and lived in. Nicholas Pileggi had access to Henry Hill and spent years interviewing him for the book Wise Guy, which became the basis for the screenplay. Henry gave Pileggi incredibly detailed accounts of his life, including specifics about crimes, conversations, and the day-to-day reality of being in the mob. That level of detail shows in the movie. But here's the thing. Henry Hill was an unreliable narrator. He lied constantly, even when there was no reason to lie. He exaggerated his importance in certain crimes. He downplayed his involvement in others. He changed details to make himself look better or more sympathetic. And Pileggi and Scorsese had to work through all of this to find the truth. Some of what Henry told them was verifiable through FBI records, court documents, and interviews with other people. But some of it wasn't. And in those cases, Pileggi and Scorsese had to make judgments about what to believe and what to treat skeptically. They didn't always get it right. Let's talk about specific changes the movie made. The murder count. The movie shows several murders. Billy Bats, Spider, and a few others during the post-Lufthansa paranoia. But the real body count was much, much higher. Jimmy Burke alone was suspected in over 50 murders. The movie couldn't show all of these without turning into a slasher film. So they focused on the most dramatic and story-relevant killings. But this means the movie significantly undersells how violent these men actually were. Tommy's death. In the movie, Tommy is killed right after he thinks he's being made. He walks into a room expecting his induction ceremony and is shot. This is basically accurate. But the movie doesn't show what likely happened after. That Tommy was probably beaten or tortured before being killed, and that his body was disposed of in a way that ensured it would never be found. The movie gives him a quick, clean death. The reality was almost certainly more brutal. The cocaine paranoia. The movie's famous May 11th, 1980 sequence, where Henry is running around doing drug deals while convinced he's being followed by helicopters, is based on real events. Henry really was that paranoid, and he really was being surveilled by law enforcement. But the movie compresses this into a single day, when in reality, Henry's paranoid behavior extended over weeks or months. Karen's role. The movie shows Karen as relatively innocent, a woman who married a mobster and gradually realized what she'd gotten into. The reality is that Karen was more complicit than the movie suggests. She actively participated in hiding evidence, transporting money, and lying to investigators. She wasn't just an innocent victim. She was an accomplice. The movie softens this because they needed her to be a sympathetic character. The relationships. The movie shows genuine affection and loyalty among the crew members. Henry, Jimmy, and Tommy hang out together. They joke around. They seem to genuinely like each other. While there was some truth to this, the reality was colder. These men didn't trust each other. They were always suspicious, always calculating. Jimmy Burke was planning to kill Henry long before Henry cooperated. Tommy DeSimone was feared and disliked by most of the crew. The movie adds warmth to relationships that were actually quite cold and transactional. Paul Vario, Paulie Cicero. The movie portrays Paulie as this stern but fair mob boss who cares about his crew. The real Paul Vario was a violent criminal who ran his crew through fear and intimidation. He wasn't a father figure. He was a tyrant. The movie needed him to be sympathetic to make the betrayal feel more significant. So they softened his character considerably. The witness protection ending. The movie ends with Henry lamenting his new life as a schnook in witness protection, but suggesting that at least he and his family are safe. In reality, Henry violated the rules of witness protection almost immediately and was kicked out of the program within a few years. The movie couldn't show this because it would undermine the ending. But it means the resolution the movie offers is actually false, the violence. This is important. Goodfellas is a violent movie. There are brutal beatings, point-blank shootings, stabbings. It's hard to watch at times, but even with all that violence, the movie still tones down how bad it really was. The real beatings were more severe. The real murders were more numerous. The real suffering was more extensive. Scorsese showed you a lot, but he still held back because showing the full reality would have been unwatchable. The humor. The movie is funny. There are comedic moments, witty dialogue, scenes that make you laugh. And apparently, some of this humor was present in real life. Henry Hill had a sense of humor, and some of the guys in the crew were funny in a dark, twisted way. But the movie uses humor to make the characters more likable and to provide relief from the tension. In doing so, it risks making the mob life look more fun than it actually was. One thing the movie absolutely got right: the mundanity of mob life. This is one of Goodfellas' greatest achievements. It shows you that being in the Mafia isn't all dramatic heists and climactic confrontations. Most of it is boring, sitting around, waiting for things to happen, doing small-time scams, having the same conversations over and over. The movie captures this beautifully, and it's one of the reasons it feels so authentic. The movie also accurately depicts the paranoia and the betrayals. The scene where Henry realizes Jimmy is planning to kill him, where he sees through the setup at the diner, is based on a real incident. Henry really did have that moment of clarity where he understood that his longtime partner was going to murder him. The movie captures the horrifying reality of that betrayal perfectly. Another thing the movie gets right: the ultimate emptiness of it all. Despite the money, the power, the respect, these men ended up with nothing. The movie's ending, with Henry complaining about being an average nobody, is meant to be tragic, but also darkly comic, because Henry still doesn't fully understand what he's lost. He's lost nothing of real value. He just thinks he has, because he's been living in delusion his entire life. But here's what troubles me about the movie. It's too entertaining. It's so well made, so engaging, so stylistically brilliant that it risks overshadowing the moral message. People watch Goodfellas, and they remember the cool scenes, the great dialogue, the iconic moments. They don't always remember that it's a story about terrible people doing terrible things and destroying their own lives. This isn't Scorsese's fault. He made the movie he wanted to make, and it's a masterpiece. But there's an unintended consequence. Goodfellas has contributed to the ongoing romanticism of mob life in American culture. It's inspired countless imitators, parodies, and homages. It's shaped how we think about organized crime, and in some ways, it's made the mob seem cooler than it actually was. Martin Scorsese has addressed this in interviews. He said that he didn't intend to glorify the mob life, that he was trying to show the reality of it, including the violence and the betrayals and the ultimate emptiness. But he's also acknowledged that some viewers take away the wrong message, that they focus on the style and the excitement and miss the substance. Nicholas Pileggi, who co-wrote the screenplay, has said similar things. He's pointed out that the movie's ending, with Henry in witness protection, alive but miserable, is meant to be a cautionary tale. But he's also admitted that some people watch the movie and think, yeah, but it looks like they had fun along the way. This is the paradox of mob movies. To make them entertaining enough that people will watch, you have to include elements that make the mob life look appealing. But in doing so, you risk undermining your own message. It's a tightrope walk, and not every viewer ends up on the right side of the line. One more thing about the movie. It's told from Henry's perspective, which means we only see things Henry saw or knew about. We don't see all the murders Jimmy Burke committed, because Henry wasn't present for most of them. We don't see the full extent of Tommy DeSimone's violence, because Henry only witnessed a fraction of it. We don't see the suffering of the victims, because Henry didn't care about them. This creates a distorted view of the story. We sympathize with Henry because he's our narrator, our entry point into this world, but Henry Hill was not a sympathetic person. He was a criminal who hurt people for decades and only cooperated to save himself. The movie makes him seem more likable than he actually was, because we need a protagonist, someone to root for, even if that person doesn't deserve our support. If Goodfellas had been told from the perspective of one of the victims, a truck driver who got beaten during a hijacking, a family member of someone Burke murdered, a woman who was terrorized by these men, it would be a very different movie. It would be harder to watch, less entertaining, and probably less successful. But it would also be more honest about the reality of what organized crime does to people. Scorsese knows this. He's a sophisticated filmmaker who understands the moral complexity of his subject matter. But he also knows he's making a movie, not a documentary. He has to entertain, has to engage, has to tell a compelling story. And sometimes, the demands of storytelling conflict with the demands of moral clarity. So is Goodfellas an accurate portrayal of the real story? Yes and no. It gets the broad strokes right. It captures the feeling of mob life. It shows you the violence and the paranoia and the betrayals. But it also simplifies, dramatizes, and in some ways sanitizes the reality. It had to, because the full, unvarnished truth is too dark, too sprawling, too morally complex to fit into a 2.5-hour movie. What I'm giving you here, this entire deep dive into the real story, is closer to the truth than what the movie shows. But even this isn't the full truth, because the full truth is unknowable. Too many people are dead. Too many secrets were never revealed. Too many lies were told and never corrected. All we can do is get as close as possible to what really happened, acknowledging the gaps in our knowledge along the way. Goodfellas is a great movie. It's one of the best crime films ever made. But it's not a documentary. It's a dramatization based on the testimony of an unreliable narrator, shaped by the artistic choices of brilliant filmmakers, and constrained by the limitations of the medium. If you want to understand the real story, you need to go deeper. You need to read the FBI files, the court documents, the interviews with victims and witnesses. You need to see past the style and the entertainment to the ugly reality underneath. And that's what I've tried to give you here, the reality, the truth behind the myth, the story that Hollywood couldn't fully tell because it's too dark, too complicated, too unsettling. This is what really happened. These are who these men really were. And this is why the story matters, not because it's entertaining, but because it's a cautionary tale about the consequences of choosing a life built on violence and betrayal. So here we are, at the end of this deep dive into the real story behind Goodfellas. We've covered Henry Hill's actual life, Jimmy Burke's murder spree, Tommy DeSimone's psychopathy, the Lufthansa heist, the women who were caught in this world, and the aftermath that Hollywood didn't show you. What have we learned? First, we've learned that the real story is always more complex than the movie version. Henry Hill wasn't a charming rogue. He was a lifelong criminal and addict who destroyed everyone who trusted him. Jimmy Burke wasn't a conflicted father figure. He was a calculating serial killer who murdered dozens of people to protect his interests. Tommy DeSimone wasn't a lovable psycho. He was a rapist and a murderer who terrorized people for a decade before being executed by his own people. Second, we've learned that organized crime isn't glamorous. It's not fun. It's not exciting. It's violent, paranoid, and ultimately empty. Every single person we've discussed in this story, every mobster, every associate, every person connected to the Vario crew, ended up dead, imprisoned, or living in fear. Not one of them got a happy ending. Not one of them achieved the dream of wealth and respect that drew them into the mob life in the first place. Third, we've learned that crime really doesn't pay. Henry Hill made millions of dollars over his criminal career. Where did it go? Spent on drugs, lawyers, and trying to maintain a lifestyle he couldn't actually afford. Jimmy Burke stole millions from the Lufthansa heist. Where is it? Rotting in some hidden location, never to be enjoyed by anyone. These men sacrificed their freedom, their families, and ultimately their lives for money they never got to keep. Fourth, we've learned about the human cost of organized crime. For every dollar these men stole, someone else suffered. For every murder they committed, a family was destroyed. For every business they extorted, an honest person lived in fear. The victims of organized crime don't get movies made about them. Their stories aren't told, but they're just as much a part of this narrative as the criminals themselves. And fifth, we've learned about the power and the limitations of cinema. Goodfellas is a masterpiece of filmmaking. It's brilliantly directed, perfectly acted, and culturally significant, but it's also inevitably a simplification and a dramatization of real events. It had to be. You can't fit the full, complex, messy reality of these people's lives into a 2.5-hour movie. You have to choose what to show and what to leave out, what to emphasize and what to downplay. The danger is that for many people, the movie becomes the reality. They remember Ray Liotta's charming narration, Robert De Niro's cool professionalism, Joe Pesci's terrifying unpredictability. They don't remember the real Henry Hill dying broke and alone. The real Jimmy Burke murdered dozens of people for no reason other than paranoia. Or the real Tommy DeSimone was a serial killer and rapist who deserved his brutal end. This is why stories like this matter. Not because mob history is inherently interesting, though it is, but because we need to remember the truth behind the entertainment. We need to see past the style and the swagger to the ugly reality underneath. We need to acknowledge the victims, the families, the people whose lives were destroyed by these criminals. Henry Hill spent his final years trying to profit from his past. He did media appearances, sold memorabilia, and generally exploited his connection to Goodfellas for whatever money he could get. Right until the end, he was still a con man, still trying to get something for nothing. He never showed genuine remorse for the people he hurt. He never tried to make amends for his crimes. He just wanted attention and money. Jimmy Burke died in prison, his body ravaged by cancer, his legacy reduced to being remembered as a serial killer. He's not a legend. He's not a folk hero. He's a footnote in the history of organized crime. A man who murdered people with industrial efficiency and died alone in a prison hospital. Tommy DeSimone disappeared into an unmarked grave somewhere. His body never found. His exact fate unknown. His family spent years searching for answers and never got them. He died as he lived, through violence, betrayal, and a casual disregard for human life that defined his entire existence. And the Vario crew, the organization that these men spent their lives building and protecting, is gone. It was destroyed by informants, prosecutions, and internal betrayals. The Lucchese family still exists, but it's a shadow of what it once was, diminished by decades of law enforcement pressure and the erosion of omerta. So what's the lesson here? What should you take away from this story? The lesson is this: the gangster life is a lie. It promises wealth, power, and respect. It delivers violence, paranoia, and betrayal. It looks exciting from the outside. The movies make it look cool. The music makes it sound romantic. The mythology makes it seem honorable. But it's all a lie. The reality is prison, death, or living in fear. Those are the only three options. If you're young and you're watching this thinking maybe the mob life has something to offer, it doesn't. If you're romanticizing organized crime because of movies like Goodfellas, stop. If you think these men were cool or admirable or worthy of respect, they weren't. They were criminals who hurt people, destroyed families, and ultimately destroyed themselves. The real legacy of the Goodfellas story isn't the heists or the murders or the betrayals. It's the reminder that crime doesn't pay, that violence begets violence, and that the gangster life always ends badly for everyone involved. That's the message Scorsese was trying to send, even if some viewers missed it. That's the truth Nicholas Pileggi was trying to convey, even if the entertainment value sometimes overshadowed the moral lesson. And that's the message I hope you take from this deep dive. The real story behind Goodfellas is a tragedy. Not a glamorous tragedy, not a romantic tragedy, but a sad, pathetic tragedy about men who made terrible choices and paid terrible prices. They're not heroes. They're not even interesting villains. They're just criminals who got what they deserved. If you've made it this far, you've spent hours learning about the real Henry Hill, the real Jimmy Burke, the real Tommy DeSimone, and the real events that inspired one of cinema's greatest films. You've seen past the Hollywood version to the truth underneath. You've learned about the victims, the families, the aftermath that doesn't make it into the movies. My question to you is, will you watch Goodfellas differently now? Will you see through the entertainment to the tragedy? Will you remember that these were real people who caused real suffering? I hope so, because that's when movies like Goodfellas truly serve their purpose. Not as entertainment alone, but as cautionary tales about the consequences of choosing a life of crime. The mob isn't glamorous. It isn't exciting. It isn't honorable. It's just violence, greed, and betrayal, dressed up in nice suits and set to a Rolling Stones soundtrack. And the sooner we all understand that, the better off we'll be. That's the real story behind Goodfellas, not the version you saw in the theater, but the version that actually happened, the messy, complicated, ugly truth that Hollywood couldn't fully capture. These men weren't heroes. They weren't even anti-heroes. They were just criminals who destroyed everything they touched. And in the end, every single one of them got exactly what they deserved. Thank you for spending this time with me, going through the real story. If this changed how you see the movie, if it gave you a deeper understanding of what really happened, if it made you think differently about organized crime and how it's portrayed in popular culture, then I've done what I set out to do. The truth matters, the victims matter, the consequences matter, and we owe it to everyone who was hurt by these men to tell the real story. Not just the Hollywood version. Now you know the truth. What you do with that knowledge is up to you.